The Spider-Man Clone Saga, or to be more accurate, the 90s Clone Saga. For years, it was known as one of the lowest points in Spider-Man history, and for even longer, it's been considered one of the worst comic book stories ever told. It was ridiculed and seemingly avoided by Marvel for a long period of time, even though the events of the Clone Saga were fairly significant for the characters in it. However, it seems recently that characters and plotlines from the Clone Saga have found their way back into Spider-Man comics. And not only that, there seems to be a new community of fans who appreciate this saga for what it was. Well, the Clone Saga is actually my favorite comic book story ever written, and for my 100th video, I thought it would be fun to explain what the Clone Saga is from the start to mostly the end. So in today's video, I'm going to be gushing about my favorite era in Spider-Man comics, the 90s Clone Saga.
Stars and Stripes!
Hello and welcome to another Carrot Scraps video, and by another, I mean the 100th. And before we get started today, I just wanted to say I can't believe we've made it to 100 uploads on this channel. In that time, I've had some highs and lows when it comes to the quality of my videos, but I've had a lot of fun growing along the way. It's been really awesome just sharing the things that I'm passionate about, and I appreciate everybody who joined me along for the journey. From Let's Plays, to reviews, to more personal videos, and then whatever strange videos I've been making recently. It's been really cool watching my content grow and change over time. Anyway, speaking of highs and lows, let's start talking about the Clone Saga, because it is absolutely filled with those. Even though I love the Clone Saga, I'm aware that it has some really low points. In fact, it has many low points, but I don't think those moments take away from the powerful high points of the Clone Saga. There are incredible stories that I absolutely adore in the Clone Saga, amongst some of the ones that I'm not super into. One of my favorite comic books ever written was a part of the Clone Saga, and that's Amazing Spider-Man 400, which is in our presence right now. Now, to be clear, this won't be a comprehensive coverage of the Clone Saga. Think of it more as an introduction or a crash course on the subject. I'll be explaining what the Clone Saga is, going over some of the more significant plot points, and I'll also be giving my perspective on the story, how it affected my life, and the reception that it got from the public. So without further ado, let's stop wasting time and talk about the Clone Saga. But before we get to the 1990s, we gotta go back to the 70s. Many people who mention the Clone Saga don't realize that what they're talking about is actually the 90s Clone Saga. The 90s Clone Saga is the infamous story that has gained the most amount of attention, but it's actually the second Clone Saga in Spider-Man history. The original story goes something like this. After the tragic death of Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker and Gwen's college professor, Miles Warren, went mad. Miles Warren being the civilian identity of the supervillain known as the Jackal, a character who would forever be an important part of the Clone Saga. It turns out he had an obsessive fixation on Gwen, and now he blamed Spider-Man and by extension Peter Parker for her death. He channels this misery into cloning, and by collecting samples from his classroom and with help from his partner, he begins cloning Gwen and Peter, eventually discovering that Peter is the superhero known as Spider-Man. The 70s Clone Saga begins with the introduction of the clone of Gwen, and as the story continues, we discover a clone of Spider-Man as well. The end of this saga leaves its readers on somewhat of a subtle cliffhanger. The final conflict has both Peter and his clone, dressed as Spider-Man, awaken in a stadium and forced to fight one another. However, since they both woke up at the same time, neither of them are sure who the clone truly is. The story ends with Miles Warren having a change of heart and giving up his life to protect the others that he put in danger. After the presumed death of the Spider-Man clone, the final moments of the story have Peter tossing the Spider-Man clone into a smokestack, with the lingering question of how he knew he was the real Spider-Man. A question that would go unanswered until the 90s Clone Saga. So now that we got the retro 70s Clone Saga out of the way, let's talk about the 90s Clone Saga. Now this is what people are talking about when they say anything about the Clone Saga. This is a comic that literally defined a generation of Marvel Comics. And if you ever hear someone speaking disparagingly about clones in relation to Spider-Man, whether that's in personal life or in the actual comic books themselves, they're probably talking about this story specifically. But what exactly is the 90s Clone Saga? Well, let's get into it. So at this time in comic book history, DC was doing really well with stories like Batman Nightfall. In addition to stories like The Killing Joke and Watchmen, DC not only was building a reputation of more mature stories, but these stories were popular, talked about, and selling well. Marvel, on the other hand, was not having as much luck. So I think there was a sense of desperation at the time from Marvel to take their most popular character and flip his world upside down for the sake of drama that was so world-shattering that it would bring old and new readers back to Marvel Comics. And so the Clone Saga was born. Now before we get into this, if you're not familiar with what a retcon is, essentially it's when a future story changes the context of a previous one. For example, example, in the original Clone Saga, the Spider-Man clone died, and Peter threw his body into the smokestack. We can say with a great degree of certainty that that was the intention with the original story. I don't think that the writer wanted to bring the character back. However, a retcon made during the 90s Clone Saga is that the clone actually survived and lived an entire life separate from Peter for 5 years. I don't think this was intended when the original story was published, in my opinion, and so that's what a retcon is. Now, this time on the road allowed the clone of Peter Parker from the 70s to gain his own identity. He would change his name to Ben Reilly, taking the maiden name of Aunt May and the first name of his Uncle Ben, and he would live life as his own person on the road. Even though one was a clone of the other, for at least 5 years, Peter and Ben had completely different lives and different experiences that shaped their personalities. However, when Aunt May became ill, the clone of Peter Parker known as Ben returned to New York City in an attempt to say his goodbyes. Ben's return to New York would bring heartbreaking drama and conflict, causing him to stay longer than intended, and leading to him taking on the title of the Scarlet Spider. Now, Peter wasn't doing the best during this time either. You could say that this was a particularly edgy moment in his history. It turned out in another retcon that Peter's believed to be dead parents were actually alive. But while forming relationships with them, it was discovered that they were actually robot duplicates. Which of course sounds silly, but it was absolutely devastating for Peter. In addition, he was having somewhat of an identity crisis, and for a while stopped calling himself Peter and just became the Spider, before deciding not to do that anymore and returning to his civilian life. Lastly, his relationship with Mary Jane was more serious than ever. The two would even learn that MJ was pregnant in upcoming issues. So when Peter and Ben met face to face once again, Peter was not exactly understanding of his return and saw it as a direct threat to his existence. This was a common thread throughout the Clone Saga, where Peter would fly off the handle and lose his temper when presented with high moments of stress, leading to some huge mistakes on Peter's part and potentially some bigger mistakes from the writers. Meanwhile, Ben donned the Scarlet Spider persona and began fighting crime in New York City. He also struggled to defend himself from other shadowy figures from his 5-year past on the road. Characters like Kane, an imperfect clone of Peter Parker who is suffering from clone degeneration, a character who would become one of the most important parts of the Clone Saga. Now, problems people had with the Clone Saga were numerous, but they focused on a handful of specific criticisms. First of all, that it was far too long. The Clone Saga was actually successful at first. However, because of its success, Marvel extended the story and delayed important plot reveals. This had the sad but inevitable result of stretching these stories and their creators far too thin. And because of that, the story is longer than it needed to be and packed with what many consider to be filler. One of the biggest problems that people had with the Clone Saga was also one of its most significant plot twists. In addition, one of its most controversial retcons. Now, spoiler alert for anyone who wants to read the Clone Saga, I know it's been a while, but, here's your warning. Essentially, the fear expressed in the original 1970s Clone Saga about not knowing who the true clone was actually true. It would be revealed in a blood test that Peter Parker was the clone and Ben was the original Peter. But 5 years ago, they confused one for the other and parted ways thinking the opposite. This made many readers frustrated with the story that they had been following for years. In addition, Peter Parker wasn't happy with this either, and he would go on to make a series of mistakes that fans were also truly upset about. Many believed that this was a ploy to make Peter, what was believed to be the married, washed-up superhero, seem uncool, so that way readers would have an easier time accepting Ben, and he could take over the role as Spider-Man in the books. In this theory, Ben seemed ideal, especially because of his single bachelor status. Who's to say what the true intentions were, though? Either way, readers didn't like this. In addition, like I mentioned earlier, Peter would lash out multiple times throughout the Clone Saga, and he would make questionable decisions repeatedly. Stuff like making deals with supervillains, teaming up with supervillains, being extremely rude to Ben, and even going so far as to accidentally hit a pregnant Mary Jane by accident. Many did not like the way that Peter was acting, and some felt as if the writers were intentionally trying to make readers dislike this character. And as a result, the Clone Saga as a whole became really off-putting to many people. As I mentioned, one of the biggest criticisms of the Clone Saga was its length. The story was extended artificially from what it was originally intended to be, and as a result, the Clone Saga was populated with a number of characters and twists. Characters like Kraven's son, the Grim Hunter, the philosopher Dr. Judas Traveler and his group of supervillain colleagues known as the Host, and Kane, laser-focused on ruining Ben's life. Not to mention, in addition to those characters, storylines like Detective Raven attempting to solve a murder committed by one of Peter Parker's clones, and accidentally incriminating Peter, the Jackal's legacy as the puppet master monster behind the creation of these clones, the poison that Peter Parker is infected with, and then he has to be rescued by one of his greatest supervillains, and the world of Ben's friend and confidant, Seward Trainer, are just a few of the many storylines in the Clone Saga. Though it was true the Clone Saga was extended beyond its natural origins, and that it was somewhat overstuffed with stories, there's no denying that there was no shortage of new twists around every corner. Though there were a lot of stories, I must admit one of my favorite things about the Clone Saga is how often a new story was ready to be told. So even though I'm open and willing to criticize the oversaturated nature of stories in the Clone Saga, their amount and frequency is actually one of the things I like about the Clone Saga as well. One of, if not my favorite Spider-Man comics ever written, is actually from the Clone Saga, and it's right next to me. Amazing Spider-Man 400 is a beautiful, heartbreaking, and visually appealing comic that I read pretty regularly. And even though future retcons would make it a little bit strange to read, I still really appreciate this comic in a vacuum. I just think it's a really beautiful comic, and if anything, I appreciate the Clone Saga for this book. But of course, I appreciate it for all of the others. Sadly, Aunt May would succumb to her illness and pass away in Amazing Spider-Man number 400. And while her passing would cause a lot of tension between Ben and Peter, eventually the two would find their way back to one another. Later in the Clone Saga, with Peter's blessing, Ben would go on to become Spider-Man, and Mary Jane and Peter would move out to Portland in preparation for their unborn child. Things seemed to be good for a time, and Ben was enjoying his life out of the shadows and making friends with new people. However, the Clone Saga would eventually come to a violent and abrupt end. In the final comics of the Clone Saga, it would be revealed that Aunt May didn't actually die as previously thought. Norman Osborn was alive, contrary to what was previously believed. Ben would die heroically, but in the process it would be revealed that he was the true clone and that Peter was ultimately the original. And perhaps the saddest reveal of them all, Mary Jane and Peter Parker would lose their unborn child. And that's how the Clone Saga ended. With that, it became an infamous period in comics. A story that promised drama and for a moment was successful, that ultimately became a victim of its own ambition, and for years would be looked at with great shame. Now, something else that was always interesting to me about the 90s Clone Saga, and something that drew me to it, was that...
Carrot? Got a minute?
Well, I'm kind of in the middle of a video about the Clone Saga, but I guess, what's up?
Yeah, about that. I didn't want to give you too much information about the future and risk messing with timelines, but I feel like I've blabbed a lot as it is. So, since you talk about clones so much, I thought you should know. You're a clone. We both are.
Wow. Who was I cloned from?
I don't know.
Was I cloned from one of the actors from Spy Kids? You remember Spy Kids?
What? No, I said I don't know.
Oh, what about America Ferrera? You remember her, right? From Ugly Betty? Was I cloned from her DNA?
Stop, just stop. You're not listening. I said I don't know who we were cloned from.
Or what if I was cloned from Danny Trejo? Or the dude from Machete? Oh, or what about that dude who got his head cut off and then they put it on a turtle on Breaking Bad? Could it be one of those people?
That's the same person you... Okay, look. Let's just say you were cloned from Carrot Prime.
Whoa, Carrot Prime. I like that. That's pretty cool.
Right? Just came up with it on the spot.
Well, don't give yourself too much credit. That's kind of an obvious name.
You know, I thought you were going to take this a little harder.
Dude, you're supposed to be me from the future. You should know better than anyone that I love clones. I mean, look, it's a little weird, right? But I've dreamed of this plot twist happening to me since I was a kid. I mean, I think this is awesome. Just as long as I'm not cloned from someone like Vince Vaughn or Shia LaBeouf, you know what I mean? You know what I mean, right? Huh? You get what I'm saying, right, Slurps?
I don't know why you're looking at me like that. I said I don't know like 10 times. But I agree, that would be an upsetting outcome.
For almost 2 decades of Spider-Man comics, the story that was meant to bring new readers to Spider-Man was largely ignored in the mainstream continuity. Certain villains would pop up occasionally, and the clone joke would be made from time to time, but overall, the comics didn't mention the Clone Saga from the 90s very often, which in my opinion was significant, because there's some pretty heavy plot points in the Clone Saga regardless of its quality. Important events that I think should be referenced and reflected on more often. Stuff like the death and return of Aunt May, the death and return of Norman Osborn, and the unfortunate loss of Peter and Mary Jane's unborn child. But for whatever reason, this storyline and its plot points were avoided for a very long time. For fans of the Clone Saga, this meant that all we had was rereading the original copies of the comics, or reading Spider-Girl comics, an alternate universe story that fully acknowledged the Clone Saga. However, as time went on, clones would find their way back into the mainstream Spider-Man comics. Kane, one of the prominent villains of the Clone Saga and the corrupted clone of Peter Parker, returned for the resurrection of Kraven. Kane would eventually go on to redeem himself, and though he was a grumpy hero, he would take on the title of the Scarlet Spider. Kane would become a prominent player in Spider-Man comics for several years, leading up to his crucial part in Spider-Verse as the Other. A 6-issue miniseries attempting to retell the Clone Saga would also be published, and then one of the biggest signs that Marvel was ready to return to the Clone Saga was the publication of the Epic Collections. Epic Collections are a really great series of Marvel trade paperbacks that collect various iconic Marvel stories, many times rearranging the comics to make more narrative sense. Marvel would release 2 sets of 5 epic books, chronicling the beginning of the 90s Clone Saga, and the second half covering the end of the Clone Saga when Ben took over the role as Spider-Man. On a side note really quickly, the Epic Collections are the best way to read the Clone Saga in my opinion. Better than Marvel Unlimited, which I'm always recommending, and potentially even better than just reading the original issues. As mentioned, these books will often put issues in the proper reading order, and with a story like the 90s Clone Saga, it can be really difficult to find the correct reading order on your own. So I really do think that these books are the best place to read if you're trying to read the 90s Clone Saga. This was huge, and I can really remember the excitement I felt when I saw these books being released. In addition, the excitement from other clone fans. I finally felt that Marvel wasn't ashamed of this part of their history anymore. Acknowledgement was all I asked. I didn't necessarily need anything big like a sequel or a resurrection, just an acknowledgement that these events happened. But as I would eventually learn, all of this was leading someplace. And it was in fact leading to a sequel and a resurrection. Which leads us to what many could consider the third Clone Saga. Dead No More: The Clone Conspiracy. The Clone Conspiracy is essentially the third Clone Saga, and is in my opinion, the most bizarre and disastrous entry. Now of course, as usual, these are just my opinions. If you really love the Clone Conspiracy, that's totally fine. I'm not trying to invalidate your enjoyment. It's just not a story that worked for me for various reasons. I actually do like a lot of things about it. There are just some things that I can't get over. Now leading up to the Clone Saga, Dan Slott had a monumental run writing Amazing Spider-Man, and he was building up interest in the Clone Saga for years. From my perspective, it's thanks to Dan that we saw a lot of these Clone Saga references in the main comics for the first time in years. I actually personally thanked Dan for featuring more Clone Saga lore when I met him in person at a comic book shop. It was something that I was really excited about and something that I still appreciate. Regardless of how I feel about the Clone Conspiracy, I really do appreciate his writing, and I especially appreciate his efforts to shake the shame from the Clone Saga. I think Dan is someone who wants to like every part of Spider-Man history, and through his run he tries to validate certain eras and references that other writers would stay away from, and I think in some ways that's really admirable. Anyway, I'm gonna spoil a lot of the Clone Conspiracy, but I'm gonna try not to get into too much detail. The Clone Conspiracy resurrected one of my favorite superheroes after almost 20 years of death, Ben Reilly the Scarlet Spider, and promptly after resurrecting him, he was made into a supervillain. And not just any supervillain, Ben had taken the mantle of the Jackal, the villain who started the original Clone Saga and played an important and horrifying role in the 90s Clone Saga. Using the New U Corporation, Ben as Jackal was the puppet master behind a new wave of cruel and dangerous clones. Clones of prominent people who had died throughout Peter's life. Most of the Clone Conspiracy was revealing that believed to be dead characters had actually returned from the grave, and then trying to discover how that happened and if they were safe. Now there were reasons why Ben turned into the Jackal, and some of them I do buy within the context of the story, but generally I'm just so done with this twist of writers turning heroes into villains. And it's kind of hard to win me over on that concept, especially when it's my favorite superhero, and especially when I think it's done a little sloppy. To make the hero into a villain thing work for me, it either has to be really interesting or really competently written. In my opinion, the writing and justification for this hero's morality switch was mostly done very poorly. The briefest way I could put it is that Ben went through a great tragedy, and I can definitely see the logic of how the character would become the Jackal. But while I can accept it, I just don't agree with it or enjoy it in the end. I can definitely get past this and read other stories with Ben in the future, but this is a story I'm just not super into. Another reason I don't like the Clone Conspiracy as much as the 90s Clone Saga is because of the way clones are presented in the story. I think one of my favorite things about the 90s Clone Saga is that excluding maximum clonage, which Yes is the name of an actual story from the 90s Clone Saga. Let's just move on. Like, we don't need to dwell on it. These things happen. Excluding that story, the exploration of the science of cloning and using clones as a story element to me always felt like it focused on the differences that could be explored between the original and the duplicates. There were a lot of stories in the 90s Clone Saga that explored the anxiety of being replaced by your clone, or the anxiety of not having a place in the world when you find out that you yourself are a genetic copy. From my perspective, most of the stories in the 90s Clone Saga built upon this idea. The idea that no matter what, these clones were more than just duplicates. Ben struggled with being a copy of Peter Parker, but from the moment he was cloned, he was his own person, and he continued to be that as time went on. In addition, Kane is as far from Peter Parker and Ben Reilly as you can possibly get, even though he's genetically identical, at least at the start of his life. However, with all of that being said, in the clone conspiracy, it feels like the main conflict is the resurrection of these dead characters through the science of cloning, and whether or not they will survive the process. Excluding some minor exceptions, these clones are presented as tragic but real resurrections and replacements for the characters who passed away. Now obviously this is a different story exploring different ideas, and these are characters cloned under different circumstances. But at least for me, this is one of the reasons why I'm less interested in the clone conspiracy. Another detail that I absolutely love about the 90s Clone Saga that I didn't really realize until I was rereading the Clone Conspiracy was that the 90s Clone Saga was filled with so many villains and twists around every corner. As I mentioned earlier, I actually kind of like the oversaturated nature of twists and stories in the 90s Clone Saga. And even though that could be a little overwhelming and oversaturated at times, I still liked that unpredictability about the Clone Saga. It is definitely an aspect of the 90s Clone Saga that can be criticized, but it's also a detail I really like. And that unpredictability and feeling of danger around every corner is missing from the Clone Conspiracy. Anyway, there are definitely aspects of the Clone Conspiracy that I like, and I'll admit it's cool to get my favorite superhero back from the dead, even if it's not written the way that I necessarily want it to be. Overall, even though the Clone Conspiracy wasn't the third chapter that I wanted, and it let me down in a lot of ways, I do appreciate it for bringing clones back into the mainstream of Spider-Man. It's really awesome to see modern Spider-Man stories deal with the affairs of the 90s Clone Saga, considering how ridiculed it was and how much shame that story carried. And so I can appreciate a story like the Clone Conspiracy that was honestly brave to bring up those plot points again. But this was not the end of the Clone Saga, it seems. Since Clone Conspiracy, we've seen clones become a prominent part of Spider-Man stories without shame for a while now. Miles Morales had his own Clone Saga, Doc Ock operated in the body of a Peter Parker clone for a while, and the main Amazing Spider-Man comics would go through the Beyond Saga, which prominently features Clone Saga characters and even gives Ben Reilly the mantle of Spider-Man again. So even though it's been a long journey since the 90s Clone Saga, I think that Spider-Man comics have healed. They'll still make the occasional joke at the expense of clones, but overall, it seems as if Marvel and Spider-Man fans are ready to embrace this part of Spider-Man continuity. And as a fan of the 90s Clone Saga, that couldn't make me more happy. Now, I'm not up to date on my Spider-Man comics because I'm currently living in Sin, but hopefully soon I'll catch up with Beyond. I'm not sure if this could be considered the fourth Clone Saga yet, other than the fact that it features some of my favorite clone characters. But obviously, whatever happens in Spider-Man Beyond, I'm just excited to see my favorite comic book character Ben Reilly back as a superhero. I think that Marvel has learned that most of their readers don't want to see Ben as a villain. I'm sorry, give me 1 second, I'm getting a call. Hello? No, I haven't read the end of Spider-Man Beyond. Why? I'm sorry, what? Oh my goodness. I don't believe you. Yeah, I said I don't believe you. They wouldn't do that. Yeah, well, I'll read it for myself and then I'll find out. Yeah, all right. I'll call you when I finish it. Unpleasant phone call, full of lies. If whatever they said was true, though, that would be more shocking than me finding out that I'm a clone. But I don't need to worry about that because I don't think Marvel would make that decision. Anyway, Now, before we go for today, I just wanted to give a huge thank you to all of you who have stuck with the channel for so long. It's been such a weird and fun journey developing this channel over the past 2 years. Whether you just discovered me with this video, or you've been watching me since the beginning, or you watched me back on Twitch, I really appreciate you checking me out. April 25th is actually the 2-year anniversary of the channel, and I just can't believe I've been making videos for that long. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for sticking with the channel. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. If for some reason you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. As regular viewers know, I make a variety of content on my channel, and I'm always gonna make the videos that I wanna make. But if you see something you enjoy, make sure to let me know, and I'll try to prioritize that kind of content in the future. If you wanna watch me play video games live, check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/carrotscraps, and all my other social media, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are at carrotscraps as well. So I wanna thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Please ignore the Spider-Gwen shirt. She doesn't have anything to do with the Clone Saga.